This is Title 18, Word Crimes. I'm Eric Arneson. On this episode, public radio veteran Scott Detrow reads Appetite by John McGoran.
To prove it was safe and effective, I used it on myself first. I went on it for 3 months before letting anybody else even try it.
John McGoran writes great thrillers. His books Drift and Dead Out are both fantastic. They feature Philly narcotics detective Doyle Carrick, though neither one is set primarily in Philadelphia. In Drift, the first book in the series, Carrick heads to his childhood home in rural Pennsylvania and finds trouble much worse than anything he saw in the big city. And in Dead Out, Carrick visits the New England coast and discovers a company creating genetically modified super bees, and that's not all they're doing. These are both great books, and I highly recommend them. The third book of the series, Dust Up, will be out in 2016. McGoran is also the author of the sci-fi story After Effects, and writing as D.H. Dublin, he authored 3 forensic thrillers, Body Trace, Blood Poison, and Freezer Burn. If you haven't read McGoran's work, I recommend starting with Drift. You'll thank me later. And now, here's the short story Appetite by John McGoran, read by Scott Detrow.
Frederick had been gone since 11, and he still wasn't back. Not good news for either of us. It was 3:15 now, and the idea of lunch had grown on me. At some point, I'd have to start taking care of these sorts of things myself, but I was not looking forward to it. Gazing out the window at the city below, it was easy to imagine life going on as it had in the past. I didn't often ask Frederick what it was like out there, but I picked things up. I knew the world had changed. The thought of it didn't bother me, as long as I didn't have to deal with it. Nothing bothered me much anymore, but change never had. Some people are afraid of change. Not me. I used to seek it. Now, I just didn't care. Maybe I was content, but my belly growled loudly. It wasn't content. It was hungry. I draped my hands across it, letting my fingers rest between the hard ridges of muscle that ran across my abdomen. Even after all this time, I was still pleased by the feel of it. I glanced at the walnut-framed mirror across the room, pleased by the look of it as well. I wasn't blind to the shortcomings of my appearance, but after growing up awkward and pudgy, I still got a thrill at the sight of my lean, hard musculature, even after 3 years? 4? I couldn't say for sure how long. It was probably 5 years since the idea first struck me while I was toiling as a lab rat for a company called Taylor & Rice, a transnational behemoth that sold everything from baby shampoo and pharmaceuticals to floor wax and industrial solvents. I was actually working in the solvent division when the idea hit me, a bolt from the blue. I quit the next day, but with my non-compete, I had to wait 2 years before I could even start working on it. 2 years without the paycheck or the meager satisfaction of the job I had worked so hard to get. That was the hardest part. 2 years working at a convenience store. But that was also how I met Frederick. Our co-workers teased us both mercilessly. Him for being a lumbering oaf, me for being soft and weak and uniquely unqualified for the work at hand. As it turned out, I had a problem completing meaningless tasks. Not Frederick, though. The barbs of his co-workers notwithstanding, he had a considerable aptitude for mindless endeavors. He even seemed oblivious to their cruelty, at least until I pointed it out to him. I confided in Frederick what I was working on, and unfortunately, he told the others. They teased me even more after that. Those last few months were the hardest. I didn't need a magic pill, they all said. I needed to hit the gym. Try a salad, they said daily, each time laughing like it was the first time anyone had ever said it. The worst of them was a guy named Jerry. He called me a few years later. I was doing well by then, and I guess he had heard. He needed money for an operation or something. Oh, that's terrible, I had said, as if I cared. I let him tell me his whole tale of woe, and he laid it on thick enough, maybe hoping I'd not only pay for the operation, but throw in a new car as well. When he was done, I wished him the best of luck and thanked him for calling. Then I hung up. The last thing I heard him say was, "But..." I still smile at the memory. Occasionally, I wondered what happened to my former coworkers. But I knew it was either one thing or the other, same as everybody else. When my non-compete expired and I could do what I wanted, I quit my job and took Frederick with me. He was uneasy about leaving the security of the only job he had ever known, but I convinced him it was for the best. I had told him it might take 2 years, but as it turned out, it was less than 6 months. In that regard, he got off easy. Certification was surprisingly simple. Each component had been previously tested. It wasn't hard to convince the FDA that together they were safe too. Venture capital rolled in by the truckload. I could have sold out then, and I would have been rich beyond my wildest dreams. But I kept it under my control, and I brought it to market. I made billions. You didn't need to go to a stupid gym, and you didn't need to watch what you ate. But every morning, you had to take one little pill called Napatine, and you had to buy that pill from me. Napatine basically turned off your digestive tract so you could eat whatever you wanted, as much as you wanted, and the fat would disappear. Maybe the best part was, it didn't matter what you ate. If you had high cholesterol, you could eat steak and butter and pizza. It didn't matter because it didn't get absorbed. Is it any wonder I grew rich? Sure, there were critics. Nutritionists said you lost valuable nutrients. But all you had to do was stop taking the Napatine and eat healthy once in a while. Or just inject some vitamins. And it wasn't like morbid obesity was all that good for you either. To prove it was safe and effective, because I wanted to slim down, I used it on myself first. I went on it for 3 months before letting anybody else even try it. Napatine worked like a dream. It even enhanced the muscle that was hiding under all that fat. Within months, I was thin and I was ripped. I became the spokesperson, the poster boy. Billboards, magazines, television commercials. I was a star. People said I became arrogant, but with a product like this, why wouldn't I? When sales leveled off, I brought down the price, and obesity became a thing of the past. It wasn't just fat people taking it either. Once they saw those former fatties sucking down French fries and chocolate cake and still losing weight, thin people started taking it too, and eating like pigs. Of course, not everyone went on it. The health freaks and Luddites said it wasn't natural, it was too good to be true. They refused to even try it. I wasn't crazy about them at the time, but I grew to love them. Some, including Frederick, were just happy the way they were. The first year using Napatine, I was careful to come off it now and then. After a while, though, I noticed some long-term changes anyway. Skin tone was one, a kind of grayish pallor. But that was a small price to pay for those rock-hard abs. I went back into the lab and created a tanning cream that struck gold again. It didn't sell like Napatine, but it sold quite a lot. After that, I looked even better. Tanned and fit. The Napatine also started to affect my thoughts. I couldn't say exactly how, but I had a sense that it did. I became more impulsive. On a hunch, I sold the Napatine at the height of its popularity, and I made sure it was to my old employer, Taylor & Rice. I could have gotten a few $100 million more from some other suitors, but I wanted it to be Taylor & Rice. I almost felt guilty about the sum I got from them, but that was another change. I had all but stopped experiencing feelings like guilt. The biggest change, and the most disturbing one by far, was that food lost its taste. I no longer enjoyed it. And what good is a pill that lets you eat whatever you want if it means you don't want to eat anything? For a diet pill, it was ideal in a way, but I liked food and I wanted to continue to enjoy it. That was when I came off Napatine for good. And that was when I realized the changes were permanent. My taste for food never did come back, or at least not like before. Instead, I felt a sort of deep, constant craving that was never sated. Those who started taking it earliest began to feel other effects as well, a few months after me. Sales of Napatine leveled off and started dropping, but it was Taylor and Rice's problem, not mine. Sales of my skin coloring cream went through the roof. I grew even richer, but I missed my food. I took supplements and protein, but there was no joy in that. For the first time, I wondered, was I getting too thin? Others wondered too. Ironically, they suspected I was addicted to Napatine. I didn't tell a soul that I'd stopped taking it months earlier. It became a hot topic in the tabloids, as if I were some kind of celebrity freak. Between the hunger I couldn't satisfy and the constant badgering, I'll admit it, I was becoming a little testy. I was one of the richest men in the world, and I was miserable. I withdrew quite a bit after that, just me and Frederick. We moved into a penthouse anonymously, my name kept entirely out of it. Frederick signed everything for me. Nobody had any idea who he was. I paid him well and trusted him completely. He was useless in many ways, but he came in handy then, and even handier later on. Maybe I'd known what was coming. Like so many rich geniuses, I became a recluse. After buying the penthouse, I bought the rest of the building. I moved my lab there, everything, and all of it in secret. And even for a genius, I was smart. I fortified it and stocked it with food and water and guns and fuel and books and movies. Everything I could ever want. Well, almost everything. I stopped going out in public and tried to cancel all my personal appearances. But as rich as I was, I still had obligations I could not deny. The last of those was a one-on-one interview with Morton Prince, the idiot host of a popular cable news show. I tried to cancel it, but the network said that wouldn't do. I had signed a contract a year earlier. We aired a flattering segment on Napatine in exchange for a sit-down. I had already postponed it several times, and the situation had changed since then. They would allow me to put it off no longer. Prince was one of those pushy, annoying types who prided himself on his tough questions and soft features. I was determined to have none of it, and I went in there ready to give as good as I got. I'd seen his show, and never particularly liked him. But when I met the man, I felt differently. I've never been a particularly sexual being, and not the least bit homosexual, but in person there was something about his soft, doughy features that I found absolutely captivating. As we exchanged pleasantries before the interview, I couldn't take my eyes off his face. Once the cameras came on, he started in on me immediately. Would I admit I was addicted to my own product? Had I concealed any detrimental side effects? He even asked me if I was wearing makeup, as if my skin coloring was any of his business. And he didn't ask just once. He hammered away, again and again and again, asking the same questions over and over as if he wasn't going to stop until he got an answer. He finally did stop, but I don't think the answer he got was the one he was looking for. In the middle of one of his sarcastic diatribes, calling me selfish and careless and negligent, I found myself unable to look away from his smooth skin and his supple, fleshy features. He was so full of himself, he didn't stop talking, even as I leaned over across the table. At least, not until I clenched my teeth on his nose and bit down as hard as I could. I wouldn't have thought my jaws were strong enough, but I bit it off easily. Perhaps the world could have forgiven me for that, but when I chewed it up and swallowed it, I knew I had crossed a line. I couldn't help myself. It was astonishingly delicious. Everything I had been missing in food and in life, and more. The studio was silent for a moment. Morton Prince was in shock. Everybody else was staring at me like I was some kind of monster. I realized then that I absolutely did not care. Not one bit. After a few seconds, Prince started wailing, and the rest of them started screaming bloody murder. I guess they were right about that, because I went back for seconds. In the pandemonium, Frederick somehow hustled me out the back door and into our car. Luckily, people seemed more interested in getting out of my way than stopping me. Frederick looked at me differently after that, but not completely so. I think he always understood the way a dog understands his master. I think he had known it was coming. The interview played nonstop on every television channel and every news website. It was the biggest story in the history of garbage media, and I totally understood why. I watched it myself, over and over, for hours on end. Prince looked ridiculous, even before I bit off his nose. Clearly he was asking for it. But in the moments before I finished him off, with his nose gone and his mouth wordlessly quivering beneath it, he looked absolutely preposterous. The commentator said I was obviously evil or insane, but for the life of me, I couldn't see it. Even with the blood running down my chin, even after I went back for his cheeks, I thought I looked quite dashing. We hunkered down after that, Frederick and I. The entire world was looking for me. When I grew weary of watching the search on TV, I went down into the lab and started working on understanding what was happening to me. It very quickly made perfect sense. The same mechanism that prevented the nutrients from being absorbed allowed certain other compounds to enter the bloodstream and then the brain. That caused some of the changes. And it was only logical that when a body was no longer able to absorb the materials necessary for human life, it would begin to crave the finished product instead. After a couple of weeks, the furor died down. A sex scandal mercifully knocked me out of the headlines. But things were never the same. I was slowly wasting away with my vitamin pills and protein powders, wondering if I was suffering from depression. But I didn't feel sad. I felt resentful. Having a mysterious void in your life is bad enough, but knowing what's missing and being unable to do anything about it is far, far worse. I continued to work in the lab out of boredom more than anything else. I came quite close to reversing the process, but by that point I had decided I didn't really care. That's when I was back in the headlines. "He's turned up in Chicago," the television said, after a young woman was found with her face chewed off. 2 days later, they said I had eaten someone in Cincinnati. Then the next day, Detroit. The day after that, I turned up in San Antonio, Texas, and a small town outside Buffalo, New York. On the same day. They scratched their heads at that point, but I didn't. I had known for quite some time it would be coming. And if the other Greys were going to be out there satisfying their appetites, I would be damned if I was going to sit there in my high-rise fortress being denied. "Frederick," I called. He came running, but there was a wariness in his face that I'd never seen before. I set him down in the chair across from me and I looked him in the eye. "Frederick," I said, "I'm hungry." His eyes darted to the door, but then they came back, and he swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" I let him decide who. I thought maybe he'd come back with someone who had wronged him, a former coworker or a bullying old classmate. But Frederick was never vindictive. He returned with a 15-year-old prostitute who said her name was Rihanna. The streets might not have been kind to her, but she smelled like heaven, and under her tattooed skin she was fresh and delicious and the loveliest shade of pink. Frederick went downstairs and turned the music up as loud as it would go. I tried to keep the noise down, but there's only so much one can do. I felt magnificent after that. I saved what was left, not wanting to waste it, but even in the refrigerator it just doesn't keep. It's not the same when it isn't fresh. Frederick kept his distance from me for a while after that, but he came when I called him, and he did as he was told. Soon he got over it. A week later, I called him to me and said, "I'm hungry again." He nodded and disappeared. I watched the television while waiting for him, but by then it was a blaring cacophony of hand-wringing and panic. You would have thought it was the end of the world. Luckily, I had stocked up on DVDs. Frederick was shaken when he came back, this time with a girl named Stephanie. She seemed relieved to be off the streets as well. I guess it was getting pretty intense out there. In deference to Frederick's sensibilities, I did Stephanie throat first. She still managed to make some noise, but I don't think Frederick heard much of it. He still looked at me funny, but not as much, and only for a day or so. The next time, I went out myself, figuring nobody would be bothered to look for me anymore. Besides, my appearance had continued to change. For the first time in several years, I was able to walk around unrecognized. That was a pleasant change. The rest of it, though, I didn't care for at all. It was loud and dirty and violent. I had my first encounter with another gray. I think it was a woman. I'm not sure. She jumped out at me from behind a bush, of all things, snarling like she thought she was going to eat me. She sniffed me and stopped. I don't know how I smelled her, but she smelled awful. Definitely not something you would put in your mouth. She nodded politely to me, and we went our separate ways. Half a block away, I found a 12-year-old boy pulling a television through the smashed back window of an electronics store. Having smelled another gray for the first time, I appreciated that much more the irresistible scent of pink meat. I dined al fresco in the back alley. There wasn't much to the boy, but perfect for one sitting. As nice as it was to be outside, though, it was not worth the aggravation. I stayed inside after that. Frederick and I settled into a routine. I didn't need much, maybe one a week or so. Things continued to deteriorate on the outside, I knew. But Frederick never once complained. I think he realized how lucky he was, living with me in our well-stocked fortress, while the rest of the world went wherever it was headed. Occasionally, there was tension. Once he even asked me, "You would never eat me, would you, boss?" "Good Lord, no," I had told him. "We're friends, you and I. I'd be lost without you." "You mean it? Have I ever lied to you?" He accepted that at first, but a few seconds later he looked right back up at me. "If you did, though, you'd kill me first, right?" I realized then he was smarter than he let on. "Enough of that nonsense," I snapped. Then I sent him out for a snack. 6 o'clock now, and Frederick still wasn't back. Outside the window, the city was sinking into a sea of darkness. Only the tips of the skyscrapers reflected the dull glow from the darkening sky. Frederick had been having more and more difficulty keeping me fed. Too many hunters and not enough prey. It occurred to me, as it did with increasing frequency, that this might be the time he didn't come back. My belly growled at the thought. It wasn't as though I set him out there unprotected. I gave him a gun from the arsenal, along with the strict rules never to bring it into the living quarters. And that wasn't his only defense. Once he brought back a gray by accident. The thing was quite agitated by the time it got home, and I ended up having to kill it. I almost killed Frederick, too, in my anger. As impressive as it was that he was able to subdue the thing, I was astounded that he couldn't smell the difference. It occurred to me, though, that if the other grays could smell the difference the way I could, my dear Frederick wasn't going to last long out there. I dragged the dead gray into my lab and distilled its essence. I made Frederick a set he could wear to mask his own, so he wasn't out there smelling like everyone's favorite meat pie. He smelled the difference then and wasn't too fond of it, but he had to admit it made his job easier. The moon was just starting to come up over the river when I finally heard the faint metallic clank of the elevator doors from 20 floors below. The hum of the generator was loud, but the grumbling of my stomach was louder. I tapped my fingers against the glass, listening to the grinding music of the elevator bringing me my late lunch. The heavy door to the living quarters rang like a lunch bell. But when it closed, I heard only a single set of footsteps. No parallel steps, no scuffling struggle, not even the soft sibilance of dead weight dragged across the floor. The smell of fake gray and poorly concealed pink filled the room. When I turned away from the window, I saw Frederick standing there, alone. Just him lurking in the shadows, his eyes hooded and haunted. He had a deep cut across one cheek. I held out my empty hands, palms up, and gave him a questioning look. "Where's lunch?" He shook his head. "Well, that's not good," I said. "Is it?" It's bad out there." He shuddered and shook his head again. "There's not much left." I nodded and took a deep breath. There was plenty of food for him here. A lifetime supply of cans and boxes and water. I had taken care of that. What about me? "Well, there's always tomorrow," I said, but that's not what I was thinking. He smiled nervously, but he didn't come any closer. "You're not angry?" I smiled back and crossed the room toward him. You did your best, right? I did, boss. I tried. I went... Shh, 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 I said soothingly. I could feel him tense up when I placed my hands on his shoulders. I'm not angry, I told him, and for a moment his shoulders relaxed under my hands. I'm just hungry, I said as I slid my hands up under his jaw. And you know when I'm hungry, I've got to eat. His eyes widened as my hands clamped either side of his face. He reached up to grab my wrist, trying to pull my hands off him. Frederick was a strapping boy, quite strong for a pink, but my hands were immovable. They didn't even wiggle. I loved that about myself, the strength I had in my steely muscles. You said you wouldn't, Frederick said in a sad, strained voice. You said you'd never lie to me. The cut on his cheek had opened up, a single fat droplet of blood welling up along it. I said I never had lied to you, Frederick. Not that I never would. I figure I'm due. I held him like that for a second, savoring the moment. Then I went in. The nose was right there, but I went for that cheek. It was obviously meant to be. But as my teeth closed and tore and came away, I heard a thunderous explosion and felt an unimaginably solid punch to the chest. Frederick screamed as I released him. He staggered back away from me, stumbling and falling, cupping his cheek. Blood seeped between his fingers. Despite the scent of gray on him, his taste was as exquisite as Morton Prince all that time ago. I closed my eyes as I chewed, and when I swallowed, he was still whimpering on the floor. I wasn't done by any means, but when I tried to get more, I couldn't. Somehow I found myself sitting on the floor, crumpled against the wall. My legs wouldn't work, no matter how hard I pushed them to. That's when I saw the hole right in the middle of my perfectly sculpted chest. Purplish blood was pouring out. That couldn't be good. I felt a flash of anger. We had a rule against guns in the living quarters, and that deceitful punk knew it. But my anger was quickly replaced by frustration. He was right there on the floor, just a few feet away, and I couldn't reach him. When I tried again, I found that my arms were no longer working right either. A rushing sound grew in my ears. I found another morsel between my teeth. It still amazed me how delicious it was. With great effort, I took a breath, and a bubble formed in the blood in the hole in my chest. As I watched, it grew, and then popped. Frederick had stopped whimpering now, and had gotten to his feet. There was a bloody crater where his one cheek used to be. I moved my eyes to look up at him, but even that was difficult. When he stepped to the side, I could no longer follow him. "Boss," he said quietly. I couldn't reply. I couldn't even blink. I felt my eyes glassing over, drying out, even though I could still see. When Frederick stepped back into view, the gun was in plain sight. I wanted to scold him, but I couldn't speak. He pointed the gun at me, but then he lowered it. "Boss," he said again, panic creeping into his voice. He crouched down to peer in my face, tears showing up in his eyes. His other cheek was right there, less than a foot away. If my neck was working, I could have reached it, but there was nothing I could do. "Oh no," he said, crying now. The tears mixed with the blood on one side. The other side was pristine, glistening. I hoped he wasn't going to shake me, but that's exactly what he did, the dolt. My head lulled to one side. I could feel myself dying from the outside in. "No, no, no, no," Frederick said over and over again, frantically pacing back and forth and crouching down again, staring at my face. "What am I going to do?" he asked. He knew I was just about gone, but he was asking me anyway. He leaned in even closer, and he looked into my eyes. What he saw must have scared him because he yelped and jumped away from me. For a moment, he froze, his eyes closed in concentration, his forehead wrinkled with effort. He took a deep breath, then he put the gun under his chin, and he pulled the trigger. The explosion echoed through the cavernous penthouse, followed by the brief sound of gentle rain as the contents of his head sprinkled down onto the floor. He stood there for a moment, as if struck by second thoughts a moment too late. Then his body toppled over and hit the floor next to me with a thud. As my vision faded to black, Frederick let out a long sigh, and I thought, what a waste. I wasn't done eating.
That was Appetite by John McGoran, read by Scott Detrow. Learn more about John at his website, John McGoran, that's JONMCGORAN, johnmcgoran.com. You can find links to John's website and his books in the show notes for this episode at the Word Crimes Podcast website, wordcrimespodcast.com. Of course, every episode of the Word Crimes Podcast is archived right there at wordcrimespodcast.com, and it's a growing collection. We have more than 24 episodes ready for you to download and listen to. And future episodes are going to include stories by Paul Brazil, Rob Hart, Angel Cologne, and Todd Robinson. It's a heck of a lineup, so be sure you subscribe right now on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you enjoy the show, please take a minute to rate Word Crimes on iTunes or Stitcher. Scott and I will really appreciate it, but more importantly, you're going to be helping other people learn about this podcast. If you want to get in touch, you can find Scott Detrow on Twitter at Scott, DETROW. And you can find me at ericarneson.com. That's ERIKARNESON.com. I'm also at Eric Arneson on Twitter and easy to find on Facebook. At my website, you can also sign up for my newsletter. I give stuff away to random subscribers periodically, so if you sign up, you might even win something, like a copy of Thug Lit magazine. The music on this episode is by The Throws. You can find them at The Throws, THROES, thethrows.com. Thanks again for listening to Title 18 Word Crimes. We'll be back soon.